Hey everybody, welcome back to the Flyin Miata garage. In today's video, we're going to cover the installation of an ND lightweight lithium battery kit. All right, now let's go over the components of the kit. First, we have our battery mounting kit. Now it includes a nice powder-coated aluminum box as well as assorted hardware and a longer battery cable. And it's going to hold our anti-gravity battery. Now there's two battery options on our site. As far as installation goes, they're the same. So if you need any specifics, please see our site. And also included in the kit is a set of SAE battery terminals. Now let's go over the tools required to be able to install this kit. Now this tool list does cover both versions, so it does mean that you might not necessarily need every tool listed. But they're fairly common tools, so they're probably something you'll have anyway. I do use a number of different drivers. None of these are absolutely required, but I have a ratcheting 3/8, an impact 3/8, a little 1/4 inch screw gun, and a 3/8 ratchet. So those are my drivers. I end up using an extension, a few different metric sockets, specifically a 10, a 12. I might also need an 11 and a 7, depending on the install. We also need a couple different Allen tools. So in this case, I have socket-driven Allen keys at a 4 and a 5 millimeter. Small pair of side cuts, a couple different hose picks. So I've got a big hose pick and a little 90-degree pick. And we need a small flat blade screwdriver. And that is our tool list. All right, we're over at the car, and you'll notice it does have a BBR turbo kit on it. Don't worry, this battery kit fits both naturally aspirated and BBR turbo kit setups. Now we are going to cover both versions of the installation in this video. They do slightly differ. Since we have the turbo kit here with us right now, we're going to start with the turbo installation. So let's get started with the disassembly. Step one is for us to disconnect our existing battery. So we need a 10 millimeter socket. We'll remove the ground terminal first, and then we'll use the same 10 millimeter socket to remove the positive terminal. All right, now we need to remove our intercooler piping. Now this is an early BBR turbo kit that still has metal intercooler pipes. So yours will likely look a little bit different, but the concept is the same. We're just trying to get the intercooler pipe out of the way of the battery. So I have a 7 millimeter socket loaded up to be able to remove the hose clamps. So I'm going to remove from the bypass valve, the throttle body, and down here, forward of the battery, we have a coupler. Now with those loosened up, we can get the intercooler pipes disconnected. All right, with the intercooler pipe out of the way, you can see how extensive it is. Now the newer BBR turbo kits that have a one-piece silicone intercooler pipe that goes from the intercooler to the throttle body, you're not wanting to remove that. You just need to pin it out of the way of the battery using something like a bungee cord. All right, now it's time to remove the battery tie-down bracket. Now the early kits used a J-hook that have a nut that require an 11 millimeter socket. So I've got one loaded up to remove it. We're just getting these loose enough to where we can fish them out of the holes. All right, now it's time to get the battery out. Now on the BBR kit, the lower battery tray is held in with two Allen head bolts that require a 5 millimeter Allen. I've got it on an extension with a driver. Now, I should have done this a minute before, but we're going to put a rag in there just to make sure no dirt, debris, or hardware finds its way into that pipe. Now we'll remove our tray. All right, now we're going to cover the next step of the installation, and that's to install a longer battery cable to the fuse box. Now, why do we need a longer battery cable to the fuse box? Well, that comes down to the profiles of the battery. You can see the new battery is significantly shorter than the stock battery. And unfortunately, the stock battery cable to the fuse box just doesn't have enough reach to drop down that low without being in a compromised position. So we provide a longer battery cable that solves that issue. Now, to install our longer battery cable, we need access to the underside of the fuse box. So I'll first remove the lid. Need a 10mm socket to remove this nut. Now, if your car hasn't been worked on much before, you might still have the zip tie joining the top of the fuse box flange to this big harness. Ours has been cut off. You'll need to remove yours since we're lifting this up out of the way. So just cut that with a pair of side cuts. We'll unplug these connectors at the back, get them swung out of the way. Now, taking a small flat blade screwdriver, we need to locate these various tab points that surround the box and pry them open while giving a slight upward pressure on the top of the box. And usually once you get about half of them or so, you can kind of fish it the rest of the way up. Okay, now the next step is we need to open this door. Now the PCM harness is somewhat in the way, so we're going to remove that. We're going to depress the lock tab, fold over the connector lock, and remove that. Now, using the flat blade, we'll open our door. Now what we're doing is we're removing this cable that runs from the positive terminal to the underside of the fuse box. Now, ours is already cut. Normally there's a zip tie that holds the cable to the bottom of the box here, and it's also surrounded by a bit of adhesive foam. So you just gently cut that foam, cut the zip tie, and you can work your cable out of position. Let's go ahead and remove this cover so we can see what we're looking at. So we're going to remove this nut using a 10mm socket. There's also a nut on the underside of the cable up here. Also requires a 10mm socket. We'll remove those and our cable will be free. Now, just to reiterate, we are reusing this red terminal adapter here, and that's because it does have some built-in fuses. So we want to retain that. We're just replacing the cable so we have more reach with it. So now, using our socket, careful not to drop it. There's our nut. And then from this side, now these are just part of an auxiliary kit, so you will not see those. But here is our main cable. So this is what we are replacing. And here is what we're replacing it with. As you can see, it just gives us a significant amount more of reach. So I'll start with the battery box portion of the installation. Now, the clocking on these does allow it to install in either position. Our cable's kind of preformed from having been installed before, but I will go ahead and get this installed. Just want to make sure it slides over that stud. Use a socket by hand to get it started. Now that I know it's started, we'll finish it up with the driver. And we'll also fish that cable down so it fits into the door there. Now at this point, we can put our fuse box back together. So we'll shut our door on the back here. We'll carefully position our fuse box top down. We just want to make sure that none of the wires underneath are going to be sticking out and get pinched in the perimeter. So we look good there. So now we can plug in our connectors. We'll reinstall our nut. We'll plug our PCM back in. And we will put our fuse box lid back on. Okay. Now let's connect the other end of the cable to our terminal block. Other guys here. Okay. All right, now we're ready to install our battery box. Now with the BBR specific installation, we are going to end up with one unused of these 5/8 thick spacers. So I'll set that to the side. So you can see here's the hardware that we will need. Now for the first portion, I'm going to take one of the M8 bolts, its washer, one of the thick spacers, and this thinner spacer, along with the bracket, and we'll go to the car. All right, first thing, I'm going to lay down my spacers. So I'm going to take my 5/8 spacer, put it on this rear hole. I'm going to take my little thinner spacer, place it in that hole. Now we're going to lay down our mounting bracket, and we're going to loosely install our bolt with washer into that hole. Now I've grabbed the other M8 bolt and I'm going to loosely mount it in place. The purpose is to be able to tighten that rearmost bolt, because once the battery box is installed, access to it is very limited. So now I have the washer on it. That's not really important because it has to come back out. And it just needs to be in there enough to keep the bracket from sliding around on that hole. So let's make sure the bracket's all square. Looks good there. So now using a 5mm Allen, we'll tighten that one down and we can remove this one. All right, now we're ready to install our battery box. Now you'll notice inside the box, there's a number of mounting holes. For the BBR installation, we are using the inner 2 mounting holes. Those will line up with the holes that exist in our bracket that we just installed. All right, now the box mounts with the logo facing forward, and the relief hole in the corner of the box will go where our first fastener is located. Line it up with our holes. M8 goes on the inboard side. Our M6 outboard side. All right, now we'll use an M5 Allen for the M8 bolt. And we will use an M4 Allen for the M6 bolt. And it's not threading into much, so you don't need to get it super tight. All right, we are back at the workbench, and the following steps are going to apply to both versions of the installation, both for BBR installations and for the naturally aspirated setups. We're going to be installing our battery terminals onto the battery. Before we do that, we do need to modify the negative terminal, and here's why. The Mazda negative terminal has a little stick down that if you don't give it clearance, it will not actually seat even onto an SAE standard terminal. So to fix that, we're going to have to grind a flat spot. Now you can use a hand grinder, you can use a belt sander, you can use a hand file. In our case, I'm using a belt sander because it's fast and it's easy. So got some safety glasses, got a pair of channel locks padded so I don't mar the brass. So we'll go over to our belt sander and get that done. Now our goal here is to just make a flat spot to where it's even with the bottom edge of the cone of the terminal. And you'll see more what I mean when I'm finished up. All right, we have our negative terminal ground. As you can see, we're just about even with the bottom edge of the taper there. So now we'll get these installed. Now within your battery kit are these little threaded blocks. We'll need those for the terminals to thread into. Now you'll want to figure out which terminals you need, because there are multiple options for positive, negative. So So the BBR turbo orientation. We will need, this positive, this negative. We will load in our threaded blocks. Put our positive in. Snug it up with a 5mm Allen. I'll do our negative. And we'll orient this. The ground cable will come in from this side. And so we'll clock it about there. You can kind of play around with that as needed. It's pretty easy to loosen these up and tighten them again. All right, now we'll get them cinched. Now let's go put it in. So our terminals will go toward the back of the car. Drop it in place. Get our lid shut. Now, in our case, the battery is able to rattle around a little bit. So the kit does include some of this thick, dense foam for you to install as needed. So we could install it on the bottom side of the lid or on the bottom side of the battery. Either one works. Okay, now we'll install our terminals. Put the positive in place. Tighten it down with a 10mm socket. Now, something to pay attention to as you get your positive terminal installed is the routing of the elongated battery cable. We want to make sure that it's not rubbing up on this PCM, especially the sharp ear. So as you can see, we have a little bit of a gap. You may just have to do some manipulation. In worst case scenario, zip tie it into position. So we're on and we're tight. So now we can reinstall our cover and we'll hook up our ground. So now before I hook up the ground terminal, I'll show you why we had to grind a relief. You can see the bottom of the circle here is not as low as this little flange here. And that little flange would originally bottom out on this collar and prevent it from seating down low enough to actually grip. So we want this little stick down flange right beneath the bolt head here to line up somewhere on this flat spot. That allows us to fully seat the terminal. If we hadn't done that, I'd probably be able to pull that right back off. All right, we'll get our pipe back in place. Now I do have a hose pick to help me get the throttle body portion on, since that can be a little bit of a pain. So we'll start with the coupler. Now we'll do the throttle body. And then we'll do the blow-off valve. And we'll tighten everything down with a 7mm socket. All right, now that we've wrapped up the turbo version of the battery kit install, we're now going to cover the naturally aspirated version. So we're back at our car, and as you can see, we're set up to show naturally aspirated. Now the observant eye will notice this isn't complete, we're missing a few parts, but for the sake of the install, everything that is needed is in place. So let's get started. All right, our first step is going to be to remove the old battery. So first, let's disconnect it. Ground terminal first, then the positive terminal, both using a 10mm socket. To get that cover off, there's just this little spring tab. So we got that out of the way. Now we have the battery retaining bracket. We have two more nuts that require a 10mm socket. Now you'll notice I didn't completely remove the nuts. That's because these are J-hooks. We just need them loose enough to unhook from the box. Lift straight up and make sure not to touch your battery terminals or you will short across it, and that is not fun. Now we're ready to take out the battery. A lot of times the insulation that surrounds it will come up with it. and that's okay. All right, now we need to remove the lower battery tray. All right, first thing, I have a 90-degree pick. Now this is going to be used to remove the wiring clip from the battery tray. I'll show you now. So we got two little tabs, one on the top, we'll push down, and then we'll push the pick down and pull up on the bottom tab while pushing back on the harness. And it takes a little wiggling sometimes. So got that free. Now we'll remove our 3 bolts retaining the tray using a 12mm socket. So your car will look mostly like this except for the pipe that's down there. That is a portion of the turbo kit that's installed in this car that's not part of the naturally aspirated setup. So for all intensive purposes, you can ignore that. All right, now we're going to cover the next step of the installation, and that's to install a longer battery cable to the fuse box. Now, why do we need a longer battery cable to the fuse box? Well, that comes down to the profiles of the battery. You can see the new battery is significantly shorter than the stock battery. And unfortunately, the stock battery cable to the fuse box just doesn't have enough reach to drop down that low without being in a compromised position. So we provide a longer battery cable that solves that issue. Step 1, we'll remove the cover. We'll unplug the 2 white connectors at the back. And swing those out of the way. Now, if your car hasn't been worked on much before, you might still have the zip tie joining the top of the fuse box flange to this big harness. Ours has been cut off. You'll need to remove yours since we're lifting this up out of the way. So just cut that with a pair of side cuts. Now we'll remove this nut with a 10mm socket. Okay, now we're ready to remove our fuse box top. To do so, we need a small flat blade screwdriver, and we need to locate all of these tabs on the outer perimeter of the fuse box. Once we get all of those sprung loose, we will be able to lift the whole thing up. So I usually give a little bit of upward pressure underneath this flange. And because ours has been off a few times before, it comes off a little bit easier. Okay, so you can see I worked about halfway around. That's usually all that's needed to be able to get that off. And we can kind of peel up and see what we're looking at here. We are replacing the cable running from here to under here. So let's also open this door, but before we do that, we need to move our PCM wiring out of the way. So we're going to depress this tab, slide the connector tab forward, lift the PCM wire out of the way. We'll fold it down here to where we can now pry open this door, and it opens up. All right, now our car has been worked on before, so there's some things missing on ours that is present on yours. Primarily that the battery cable here would be wrapped in this foam and also have a zip tie securing it to the fuse box. So you'll need to cut the zip tie with a pair of side cuts, carefully razor that foam sheet to be able to liberate the harness, as you can see ours is. Okay. Now I've got a 10mm socket. I'm going to undo the nut from the bottom side of the fuse box here. Might be a little hard to see. So now the cable's separated from the fuse box. We can pull it out. And now we'll separate it from the terminal. Now ours has a few auxiliary things wired into it as well. These little extra spades. Yours will not have that. Just gotta remove that nut. Okay, there's the cable we're removing. And here is what we're replacing it with. As you can see, it just gives us a significant amount more of reach. So I'll start with the battery box portion of the installation. Now the clocking on these does allow it to install in either position. Our cable's kind of preformed from having been installed before. but I will go ahead and get this installed. Start with the fuse box portion. Slide it over the stud. Get it started by hand. And get it nice and snug. Now we'll route the cable back out the back door here. And we can go ahead and put our fuse box back together. Pay attention to some of the wiring underneath. Just make sure none of it is going to get pinched in the perimeter frame. So we're looking good there. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's shut our door first. Now we'll snap our fuse box down into position. We can plug our PCM back in. We can plug these two connectors back in. Add our mounting nut. And add our lid. Now we'll add the other end of the cable to the terminal block. In our case, we'll re-add our accessory wires and we'll re-add our nut. Okay, now we're ready to add our battery box. All right, the first thing you need to locate from your kit is these two 5/8 aluminum spacers. We'll get those placed down here. Now we're going to use the forward and aft battery box mounting points. You want to just set it right over the threaded hole position. Be careful not to bump it as you drop your battery box in. Now it's time to drop in our battery box. Now you'll notice there's a few different mounting holes in the bottom of the box. Those will vary depending on whether you're installing the turbo or the naturally aspirated setup. Also, within the differences between the two setups is the hardware. You will not need supplied bracket or the M6 bolt or the M6 washer or spacer with the naturally aspirated kit. So we only need those two spacers we've already installed and the two M8 bolts and their washers. So let's install this. It's going to install with the holes on the outboard side of the car, so toward the driver's side. And then again, we don't want to knock those spacers out of position as we drop this in. It's a good idea to drop your bolt in and at least get a couple threads going. All right, now that we have our bolts started, I'm going to go ahead and get them tightened up using a 5mm Allen tool. All right, we are back at the workbench, and the following steps are going to apply to both versions of the installation, both for BBR installations and for the naturally aspirated setups. We're going to be installing our battery terminals onto the battery. Before we do that, we do need to modify the negative terminal, and here's why. The Mazda negative terminal has a little stick down that if you don't give it clearance, it will not actually seat even onto an SAE standard terminal. So to fix that, we're going to have to grind a flat spot. Now you can use a hand grinder, you can use a belt sander, you can use a hand file. In our case, I'm using a belt sander because it's fast and it's easy. So got some safety glasses, got a pair of channel locks padded so I don't mar the brass. So we'll go over to our belt sander and get that done. Now our goal here is to just make a flat spot to where it's even with the bottom edge of the cone of the terminal. And you'll see more what I mean when I'm finished up. All right, now that our terminal is ground flat, as you can see, we're just about even with the bottom edge of the taper there. Let's go ahead and add these terminals to the battery. Now you need to pay attention to the orientation of the battery within the car. In the naturally aspirated setup, we're going to have our positive mount here and our ground mount here. So we'll take those caps off. We will take 2 of the supplied threaded blocks from the battery kit, install those underneath. Now we will take our terminals, obviously red to positive, snug that up with a 5mm Allen. Now we'll take our ground. Now remember, we ground this side flat, so we might leave this one loose until we know what position we need it to be in. So I'll at least get the thread, at least get it snug for now. Okay, now we're ready to put this in the car. All right, now let's put it in. So we got our battery in. We'll put the lock pin in place. Now you might notice, depending on your install, that there might be a little bit of movement in your battery. The kit also includes these foam blocks that you can cut as needed and fit within your box to firm up the mounting location. I would recommend putting this on the bottom side of the battery box. Okay, now that we have our battery in position, it's time to hook up our terminals. So with the extra length provided by the battery cable, we will get our positive terminal pushed down into position and tightened up. Now you do want to pay attention to the routing of that positive cable. Make sure it's not going to rub up on the ear of the PCM here or anything. Use zip ties as needed to keep that free of chafing on anything sharp. Now we can go ahead and install our, oh, we might actually need to move this, clock it just a little bit, and that will allow our cover to reinstall. All right, and now we're ready to do the ground. Now the reason for the flat spot on the ground terminal is due to the way that Mazda designed this ground terminal connection. As you can see, the base circle of the terminal, over here there's a protrusion down below that base circle where it retains the stud. That would actually hang up on the lip of this and keep it from seating all the way down. So even when you got it completely tight, it would still pop right off. So providing that relief for this little tab will allow it to seat fully into position. So we have that fully down. We have that tight. And now remember, we only got this snug. So now we'll come back in and with a 5mm Allen, make sure the ground terminal is tight. All right, that does it for these installations. Now we covered the installation of both the naturally aspirated and the turbo setup for the ND lightweight lithium battery kit. If you have any questions during your install, please give us a call or send us an email. We'd be happy to help you out. And if you liked this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And go ahead and let us know what kind of videos you want to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.